It is with pride that I welcome you to the Scholarly Presentation, a special biannual event that highlights the exceptional quality of our faculty and their individual expertise. Scholarly presentations are in part due to the work and dedication of the Scholarly Presentation Committee, who selects the speaker each year. The committee is composed of faculty from various disciplines who themselves are past presenters. I'd like to thank the committee and the committee's chair, who you'll meet in just a moment, David Stevenson, for their time and commitment to bringing topics of unique interest to the college community and to the community at large. Before I introduce David Stevenson, who will introduce the speaker, I want to extend a special welcome to our Vice President of Instruction, Dr. Jerry Buckley, who I believe is here. Thank you. And the member of the Board of Trustees of the Santa Clarita Valley Community College District, who has joined us this evening, Joan McGregor, on behalf of the Board of Trustees. And I believe I see Murray Wood as our foundation representative here as well. And I hope I'm not missing anyone else in the lights that blind me from the stage. I also want to thank the COC Foundation for its generous sponsorship of the annual scholarly presentation. Now, I'd like to turn it over and introduce David Stevenson, who will introduce our presenter for the evening. You're in for a treat.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our scholarly presentation. As you can see from our program, we've been doing this now since 1997, and it's a fantastic thing that we do twice a year. And tonight's presentation from Dr. Phil, or Dr. Phil Gussin, will be another one of our outstanding presentations. I have some very brief things that I want to say, just some things to students and others about our presentation tonight. So for example, if you're here as a student, and I know many of mine are here tonight, and other departments, that you will be getting your ticket after our presentation tonight, which you could take back to your faculty members to get credit, extra credit, or however your professors are rewarding you for coming tonight. And hopefully you're here because you want to be here. But we have a few things that we need to take care of ahead of time. I have a number of thank yous that I need to do, so that way we won't have to do it at the end of the night. At the end of the program tonight, Joan McGregor, who's representing the Board of Trustees, Dr. Jerry Buckley, who's representing the administration, and Murray Wood, who's representing the foundation, will come up and present Phil with his awards that he gets after completion of his presentation tonight. But there are a lot of people and areas in the college that are important in putting this on, so I'd like to thank them if I could. First of all, the Board of Trustees. Without their support, of course, we would not be able to do this. The administration here at the college, the COC Foundation, our Scholarly Presentation Committee, all of the members are listed in your program. We have the theater staff and all of the volunteers that are here tonight on their own time, helping you to be safe and to enjoy our presentation. Sean Irwin and Sean Hughes are our visual audio people. And Naomi Cherigate is helping with Phil's presentation tonight, and she's done a great job with the slides. Also, we're live streaming tonight at cougarnews.com, and if you're interested, the presentation will be presented at YouTube at a future time. There's a flex sign-in sheet for the faculty members in the back. Tickets for the students after it's done. There's a reception after our presentation for faculty and staff. Now, before we get to Phil, a couple of other things that I'd like to do. This past year, we lost one of our longtime committee members, and that is Sally Diedrichson. She was our emeritus faculty member on our committee, and I would like to say a few words if I could, because she was a good friend of mine. She brought a lot of humor, a lot of insight, and a lot of love for what we did, and really helped to grow the scholarly presentation. I want to say thank you to her. I hope she's here tonight with us watching, and I know that I will and we will all miss her. The second thing that we'd like to do tonight is that we have a very important committee member who will no longer be able to be on our committee, and we're very sad about that. He is our foundation member, and that is Judge Frank Kleeman. If he'll stand, please, I'd like to have everyone acknowledge Frank. Frank has brought leadership, dedication, mentoring, inspiration, guidance, and friendship to all of us. And we and Murray, who just presented him with a wonderful plaque, and I hope that he will always remember us because we will always remember him. Thank you, Frank. Now, if I may, I very quickly am going to introduce Phil to you, and I have a few paragraphs here to share with you. After working for more than a decade as a plumber and a plumbing contractor, Phil sold his business and returned to college at age 38. So for all of you returning students, yay, Phil is a great example of our returning students here at COC. He received his master's degree in political science from California State University, Northridge in 1998, a second master's degree in 2003, and a doctorate in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. And I don't have a date on that. Utilizing innovative experimental techniques, his dissertation examined the impact that visual images in the news have on citizens' political preferences. In 2007, Gussin co-authored an article in the Quarterly Journal of Political Science with Dr. Matthew Baum entitled "In the Eye of the Beholder, How Information Shortcuts Shape Individual Perceptions of Bias in the Media." This article examined the extent to which individuals use heuristics or information shortcuts to assess the ideologic biases of news coverage. Phil began teaching at College of the Canyons in 2005. He has also taught at a number of community colleges in the greater Los Angeles area, as well as Pepperdine University and UCLA. In his final year of teaching at UCLA, Phil was the recipient of the My Last Lecture Award, which is given to the professor that students find to be the most inspirational. Phil is the co-advisor for the college's Political Science Club and the faculty advisor for the award-winning College of the Canyons Model United Nations team. But before I bring up Phil, just a thought. At the end of our presentation tonight, if you could, please try to stay in your seats because we do have a very important presentation for Phil at the end. I present to you Dr. Phil Gussin.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, for coming here today. I appreciate you coming out here on a Thursday night to spend some time listening to me. I know some of you are getting extra credit for doing it, but I'm just going to assume that you're here because you're really interested in what I have to say. Thank you for faculty members for being here. I appreciate that as well. This is actually, unfortunately, the first time that I've attended a scholarly presentation, and I know that I'm going to make an effort to do this in the future. So thank you, everybody. My family's here, although I don't know where they are. There's my wife. Cool. Okay, and Michael. Okay, so thank you, family members, for being here as well. And then once again, Naomi's sitting over there. David already introduced her, but I want to once again thank Naomi for participation in this. Without her, this would have been a much more difficult process. And then I want to thank the Scholarly Presentation Committee as well. I didn't quite know what to expect when I was going to go ahead and when my proposal was accepted. The process of working with the Scholarly Presentation Committee was actually quite beneficial. The performance that you're going to see, the presentation you're going to see is different because of the input that they provided. And it was a learning process, and I enjoyed it. And so I would encourage other faculty members who are here to, when the round of proposals opens up again, to go ahead and do this, because it was, along with the opportunity to talk about a subject that I love, it was a learning experience. It was an opportunity to work with colleagues whom I haven't had the opportunity to work with before. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and start. And I want to start today by going ahead and pointing out what I'm not going to be talking about tonight. If you came here hoping that I was going to be able to answer the question, does the media have a liberal bias? Does the media have a conservative bias? You're going to be disappointed, because that's not what I'm going to talk about. The motivation for this presentation was an experiment, as David mentioned, based on an experiment that I conducted with a colleague at UCLA that explored the extent to which people's perception of bias in the media is really a reflection of their own biases. The idea being that when you see bias in the news, what you're seeing is partially what's in the news, but it's also you. And that's where we're headed. That's the argument that I'm going to make. I'm going to argue that some of the bias that you see in the news, to the extent that you see it, is really your own bias being reflected back at you. Now, in saying that, I am not suggesting that all media outlets are fair and balanced, to borrow a phrase. Clearly, some are not. But I don't plan to weigh in on that. So anybody who's came here hoping that I was going to spend some time bashing on Fox or bashing on MSNBC or CNN, that's not going to happen either. Now, before I go any further, I want to go ahead and make sure that I explain what I mean by bias, just so that everybody's on the same page. Some people claim that the media has a liberal bias. And what they mean by that is they say that the way that the media reports the news is done in such a way that it benefits Democrats or Democratic candidates or Democratic causes. So they say it has a liberal bias. Some people say that the media has a conservative bias. And what they mean by that is that the way the news is reported, it tends to benefit Republicans, Republican causes, Republican candidates. It's this claim, specifically, that the media as a whole tends to favor one party over another that I'm going to be addressing in this presentation. And to get to that point, I'm going to take you on a journey through the topic of bias in the media. In the first part of the journey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some of the challenges that scholars face when studying bias in the media. I'm going to talk about some of the problems associated with identifying and studying the media as a whole. After that, I'm going to talk about some of the problems identifying bias, what we mean by bias, from a scholarly perspective, as a political scientist or as a communication studies scholar. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges associated with trying to measure bias, what we call operationalizing bias. And the main point that I'm going to be trying to make in this presentation, in this part of the presentation, is that it is virtually impossible for somebody who's committed to scientific methods of inquiry to go ahead and answer the question, does the media have a liberal bias or does the media have a conservative bias? In the next part of the journey, we're going to leave the world of scholars, and I'm going to go ahead and examine some of the claims that are made by those who argue that the media has a liberal bias or conservative bias. First, I'm going to address the argument that's made by some that the fact that most Washington-based journalists are Democrats, and they are, is really all the evidence you need to know that the media has a liberal bias. But what I want to do is I want to explore the theoretical foundations of that argument, and I refer to that as the demographic blinders thesis. Following that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to address the other position, that the fact that media corporations, that media outlets are owned by large corporations is really all you need to know that the media has a conservative bias. But what I'm going to do is explore again the theoretical foundation of that argument, and I refer to that as the profit motive thesis. My goal tonight isn't to discredit either position because they both have their merits, but rather to suggest that both tend to oversimplify the question of bias in the media. Now, in the last part of our journey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the article I co-authored with Professor Baum entitled In the Eye of the Beholder that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Political Science. I'm going to describe the design of the experiment, what we were trying to do, and then explain the results. And as I said before, in the short, what we found in our experiment was that the bias that people see in the news, some of the bias they see in the news, isn't really in the news. It's kind of like you're looking out a window at night and you see a reflection and you think someone's outside. That's you, looking back at you. And when it comes to bias in the media, oftentimes what we're arguing is that's exactly what's happening. That's going to be the journey. We're going to drill down into this question of media bias, and to the extent that there's a running theme through the entire presentation, it's this. The issue of bias in the media is really, really complicated. So let me begin. As a political scientist, my goal, my challenge is to go ahead and study political phenomenon using scientific methods of inquiry. This isn't true just about political scientists. This is true about many of the professors who are in this room. Whether they're studying biology, anthropology, sociology, they're involved in the same endeavor. And while this isn't always appreciated, and I would say maybe even not always appreciated within the scholarly community, because we're committed to the scientific process, because we're committed to that, it limits the kinds of questions that we're able to ask, and as a consequence, it limits the kind of answers that we can provide. Now, this is not to suggest that scholars haven't attempted to answer the question, does the media have a liberal bias or does the media have a conservative bias? They have. But when they do, they always, and I mean always, have to go ahead and modify the question in some way. This question they have to modify because as it's stated, it's unanswerable. So in the first part of this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deconstruct this question. I'm going to take it apart, piece by piece, to show you guys what I'm talking about. I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time talking about this, but I think it's really important in understanding the second part and the third part of the presentation and the challenges that we face as scholars studying issues like bias in the media. Now, in order to use scientific methods to study anything, the terms of a research question, and that's what this is, this would be a research question, they have to be very precise. So I'm going to use an example that has nothing to do with bias in the media whatsoever. Let's suppose I'm interested in going ahead and assessing the extent to which being in love affects a person's well-being. So this is my research question. How does being in love affect an individual's well-being? Now, in order to answer this question, I need to define all the terms in it. So I would need to define what I mean by in love. I would need to define what I mean by well-being. But we're just going to focus on the in love part. There are a number of ways that I could go ahead and try and identify who is and isn't in love in my experiment. One way would be to just administer a survey. Just go ahead and ask people, are you in love? Anybody who says yes, I say, oh, this is someone who's in love. Anybody who says no, I say they're not in love. Easy enough. But there's a problem with that approach. It might not seem obvious, but there is. What about people who are in abusive relationships? They may go ahead and describe themselves as being in love, when the truth is that I would probably be more inclined to describe what they are in as in fear. And that's not really what I'm interested in studying. So I really don't want to, I want to find a way of measuring whether somebody's in love in a way that's not going to include these people. So what I could do is I could say, okay, you know what I'm going to do? Here's what I'm going to define in love. I'm going to measure the chemicals in someone's brain throughout my experiment. I'm going to look for people who have high levels of dopamine, high levels of serotonin. These are chemicals that are associated with feeling good. And then anybody who registers high levels, I'm going to call them in love. Anybody who doesn't, I'm going to say they're not. And this is going to exclude people who are in abusive relationships because they're going to have low levels of these chemicals. Seems like a better way to approach it. But here's the problem. Somebody who's clinically depressed is going to register low levels of this chemical, and they may actually be in love. No matter what method I go ahead and use to try and define who's in love, what is in love, there are going to be some benefits and there are going to be some drawbacks. Now, the question is, which way is better, surveys or chemicals? The truth is, I don't know. But what I do know is this, is if I'm going to attempt to answer this question using scientific methods of inquiry, I'm going to have to define all the terms in the research question very specifically, and I'm going to have to explain why I chose a particular method. If I use a survey, I'm going to have to explain why I chose that method. If I use chemicals, I'm going to have to explain why I did that. Everything has to be explained in a research question. So with that in mind, let's return back to the question that I'm actually not going to answer tonight. Does the media have a liberal bias? Does the media have a conservative bias? And to answer this question from a scholarly perspective, once again, I have to define the terms. I have to define the terms. So here's what I want you to do. I want everyone just for a second to go ahead and stop for a moment and think about this concept, the media. The media. Suppose you're in a class of mine. Some of you actually are, but suppose everybody was in a class of mine. And I went ahead and I asked you to go ahead and write down on a piece of paper, what do you mean by the media? When I say the media, what do you include in that? What sources do you include? And I'm focused on political news, so not anything that reports on Miley Cyrus's latest ventures. I'm not interested in that. Sports, Adrian Peterson, none of that, just political news. What do you mean by the media? And then I want you to keep that in mind. However you define that, whatever that means to you. Now, if I'm going to do a study examining what the media, like I said, I have to define the term. So let's consider what we really mean by the media. First, national newspapers would certainly qualify as part of the media. In fact, oftentimes when people go ahead and make claims about the media as a whole, it's based on what they've seen published in a couple of national newspapers, and they just assume that that represents all media outlets, like every media outlet follows their lead. Now then again, there are some papers that are published locally, right? And I actually found a comprehensive list of all the local papers published in the United States, and originally I was going to include them all on this slide, but then I realized it would take hours to get them up there. So I only focused on local papers in Alaska, Alabama, and Arizona, and in California. And then in California, I only included on this slide local newspapers that are published in cities whose names I recognize, including our very own local paper, the Santa Clarita Signal. There we go, thank you. News programs on the major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, these certainly qualify as the media. These include the nightly news broadcasts. They include the Sunday interview programs like Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and they also include programs like 2020. Then there's also something called soft news. You may not be familiar with that term. Soft news refers to programs that people watch primarily for the entertainment value, but they run into political information. Probably that describes it for a lot for you guys. The Daily Show would be an example. The Colbert Report. And then there are local TV stations. For the sake of convenience, I only included TV stations in and around the Los Angeles area. But there are literally hundreds of local TV stations across California, thousands across the country, and whether they service 1 or 1,000 or 10,000 people or 100,000, they still qualify as the media. Then, of course, there's radio. For the purposes of this slide, I've only included radio stations that bill themselves as talk radio or news radio in California only. There's thousands of other ones. And I've included the cable news programs that are on Fox, programs that are on MSNBC, programs that are on CNN as part of the media. This is a small sampling of what we're talking about, what we really mean when we're talking about the media. And the thing is, this list is not anything close to exhaustive. This is a small sample of the media. When people talk about the media, they're making a very huge claim. They're saying that they understand something about that big group, way more than that, because the media itself is far more diverse than what that slide represents. In fact, there are a number of news sources that I didn't include there. And I'm going to take a chance here. I want to ask you guys a question. And I know that people are usually uncomfortable speaking up in large groups like this. And I know that, especially when I taught evening classes, when I have students in a class and I ask a question, oftentimes I'll go ahead and ask a question of them, and this is what the response sounds like. Okay? But this is a little bit different. And then usually what happens is one brave soul, they go ahead and they say something, we get a conversation going. Now, in this room, it's a little bit different because we have professors in here. And depending on the nature of the question, if you ask a room full of professors a question, this is what it sounds like. Okay, so I'm looking for something in between crickets and rabble, 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 okay? For the names that you saw on the slide, are there any news sources that you rely on that you didn't see up there? Okay, NPR's not on there, correct. Vern, you had your hand up? Okay, anybody else? The Daily Beast. Back there on the top. It doesn't matter. I've never heard of that outlet before. I can honestly say. It's like, come on, students. Are you guys chicken? The Drudge Report. The Drudge Report wasn't on there either. The Huffington Post wasn't on there. As a matter of fact, there were no online sources on there at all. Like, that thing was full. There were no online sources. The AP, Reuters, UPI, none of the wire services were on there. Right? That was a partial list of the media. A partial list. And there were no, by the way, there were no international sources on there either. So the BBC wasn't on there, Al Jazeera English wasn't on there. In other words, that list was by no means exhaustive. The media is much larger and much more diverse than that slide suggests. And that's precisely why it's so difficult for somebody who's committed to studying the media, using scientific methods of inquiry. Now, it can be done. If I want to do a study of the media, the whole media, right, this is what I'd have to do, basically. First, I would compile a list of all media outlets. Maybe rank them from the ones that are watched the most to the ones that are watched the least. Then I could take a random sample of them to select which media outlets I was going to go ahead and look at. Then I would determine the time frame that I was going to study, or even randomly select different time frames. And then I would go ahead and I'd still have to figure out what I mean by bias and then how I measure bias and then go ahead and do it. It would be really complicated. It would be a daunting task to study the media as a whole. And so the next time you hear somebody make a claim about the media having a bias in one direction or the other, just ask yourself this question. Were they talking about that group that I had up there? That was just a partial sample of the media? Is that what they were referring to? Or were they referring to one or two or three small outlets or even large outlets that they've decided somehow are representative of the media as a whole? Because here's the thing, as a scholar, as a political scientist, I don't have that luxury. If I'm going to make a claim about the media, I have to study the media. Or if I'm going to study a small group of media outlets and make a claim about the media as a whole, I have to go ahead and justify that. I have to explain which media outlets I studied, why I studied them, and why I ignored others. And here's the thing. Trying to study the media as a whole is actually a relatively small task compared to going ahead and trying to define what we mean by bias in a scholarly and an objective way, defining what is and isn't bias. The talking heads, the pundits, the politicians, they can go ahead and define bias however they want. If they want to go ahead and they want to say the media has a liberal bias because the coverage that then Senator Obama received in the 2008 presidential elections was incredibly favorable, and it was incredibly favorable, they can go ahead and make that claim. No one's going to ask them for their data. No one's going to ask them how they define bias. And most importantly, no one's going to ask them why they ignored the incredibly unfavorable coverage that President Obama received right before the 2014 elections, midterm elections. If someone wants to go ahead and make the claim that the media has a conservative bias because of the incredibly favorable coverage that President Bush received after 9/11, or in the months leading up to the war in Iraq, they can do that. Again, no one's going to ask them for their data. No one's going to ask them how they define bias. And no one's going to ask them why they didn't study and look at the incredibly unfavorable coverage that President Bush received when the war in Iraq became unpopular, or immediately after the 2007-2008 financial crash. As scholars, as political scientists and other colleagues here, we don't have that luxury. We don't get to pick and choose our evidence. If we make a claim about bias, we have to go ahead and define bias. We have to justify what we do. And defining bias is probably harder than you think. So once again, I want you to take a moment and think about how you define bias. How do you know when coverage is biased or not? Is it biased because it doesn't represent the truth? Does it only show one side of the story? Does it ignore an important fact or maybe overemphasize another one? Does it include something irrelevant and unimportant and make it seem important? And what I'm hoping is that however you define bias, it's not because it was on Fox. If it was on Fox, it's bias. If it was on NBC, it was bias, right? That shouldn't be your method. However you define bias, the same thing on any network would be defined as bias. And I'd like you to keep that in mind, and we're going to talk about this idea of bias by examining coverage of a recent event, the Ebola crisis. Okay, now, there we go. That was the dramatic Ebola crisis thing. For a couple reasons, the Obama administration had to be very unhappy of the coverage of the Ebola crisis. Okay. I didn't know Naomi was going to do that again. Are we going to do the bias every time I say this? Okay, thank you. Okay, the reason that they were upset about the Ebola thing, mostly because there was no crisis. On Election Day, I don't know if you guys recall, but on Election Day, one person in the United States, there are 350 million people in the United States, one person had Ebola, and he was a doctor who had contracted it in West Africa and was being treated here, and he's been since declared Ebola-free. On Election Day, Nurse Pham, one of the two people who actually contracted Ebola in the United States, she had been declared, by Election Day, she had been declared Ebola-free, as had her lovable dog, Bentley. Now, thinking in terms of bias, many liberals claimed that Fox News was purposely trying to frighten people right before the election by going ahead and covering the Ebola crisis. Okay, there we go. I think we're free of that. They were discussing travel bans. They were discussing travel bans, right? They were discussing mutations of this disease and why it might become airborne. Or they were discussing terrorists using Ebola as a weapon. All these kind of very scary things. And so what I want you to think about is whether or not that Fox coverage would have qualified as biased by your definition. Could you point to some part of the way you were thinking about bias and say, yeah, that fits. See, that's what I was talking about. That was bias. Because I suspect that the Obama administration thought the coverage was bias. And if you agree, here's what I want you to consider. Many of the issues being raised on Fox were being reported on rather extensively on MSNBC as well. There was a ton of coverage on MSNBC. And although the tone was different, they were covering it. And they were covering it a lot. And the Obama administration couldn't have been happy about that, simply raising the issue of Ebola right before an election that wasn't looking too good for Democrats in the first place. They could not have been happy about that. So this is my question. If coverage on Fox fit your definition of bias, did the coverage on MSNBC fit your definition? In other words, was MSNBC guilty of having a conservative bias? Because that is something that they have never been accused of. Now, keeping your definition in mind, let's consider coverage of another event. The riots in the Pumpkin Festival, at the Pumpkin Festival in Keene, New Hampshire last month. Now, if you weren't aware of the riots at the Pumpkin Festival in Keene, don't worry. They got very little coverage, although, as you can see, they involved a lot of bad activity, right? Young people were rioting, police were called out in force, in riot gear, tear gas had to be used to break up crowds, property was destroyed. In many ways, the rioting in Keene bore a striking resemblance to the riots in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, before I continue, I want to make sure that I am not talking about coverage of the peaceful protests that happened in Ferguson. I'm talking about the riots. The riots in Ferguson, the people who were behaving lawlessly, had many of the same elements of the riots in Keene, New Hampshire. Young people were rioting. The police were called out in force, in riot gear. Tear gas was deployed to break up the crowds. There was talk about the over-militarization of the police. Property was destroyed. And yet Keene received very little coverage, and Ferguson received a ton. As most of you know, the riots in Ferguson were triggered by the shooting of an unarmed black man by a white police officer. From what I understand about the Keene riots, they were triggered by different kind of shots and maybe beer. So they were different. Now, a little later in the presentation, I'm going to offer some explanations for the difference in the coverage. But for now, here's my question. Would the difference in coverage of the events in Keene versus Ferguson have fit your definition of bias? For example, some argued that the extensive coverage of the rioting in Ferguson reinforced a negative stereotype about young black males as dangerous, as lawless, as scary. The decision not to cover white males rioting and a similar kind of, evidencing similar kind of behavior was something that only reinforced the idea that black males riot and reinforce that stereotype. Whites don't do this. Based on your definition, was the difference in coverage an example of bias? And if it was the problem that there was too much coverage of Ferguson or not enough coverage of what happened in Keene? The point here that I'm trying to make is that it's incredibly difficult to provide a specific definition of what constitutes bias, if not impossible. And I suspect that if I were to go ahead and ask everybody to write out a definition of what constitutes bias, everybody in the pack writes one, and you sent it up to me, I would have as many different definitions as there are people here tonight. The whole debate over defining bias, what we mean by bias in the media, reminds me of a very famous court case in which the Supreme Court had to decide whether hardcore pornography was protected by the First Amendment. In that decision, Justice Stewart wrote about the difficulty of coming up with a precise definition of what constitutes hardcore pornography. And this is what he wrote. I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I never could succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it. And I suspect that's how most people identify bias. They may not be able to provide a clear-cut definition, but they know it when they see it. Now, pundits, talking heads, politicians, they can go with that definition. Scholars can't. Political scientists can't. Communication studies scholars can't. Does that make us better than politicians, pundits, and journalists? No. Oh, yes, but that's not the point. There's a separate issue. We'll make another presentation. The point is that as scholars, we have to play by a completely different set of rules. And those rules require us to define things. But here's the thing. Even if we were to figure out what we meant by the media, go ahead and actually study the media, provide a definition of bias that everybody could agree upon, we would still have a problem figuring out how to measure it. It's actually really complicated. And you probably haven't thought about this, but it is. So let me explain. Suppose we've all settled on a definition of bias that we all agree upon. We're cool with the definition. You can even use your definition, whatever you had in your mind. And we have a simple task before us. We have to determine whether a newspaper article is biased or balanced. That's it, just one article. We're not studying the whole media, one newspaper article. Okay? For our purposes, here's our article. Suppose the article includes something that, according to your definition, is an example of liberal bias. That's President Obama, very happy. Suppose there's an example of something that fits your definition of a conservative bias, right? Which obviously makes President Obama very unhappy. Now, just to be clear, for those of you who read left to right, don't assume the positive comment came first. For those of you who read Hebrew, don't assume that the negative comment came first. This can go back and forth in any direction. There we go. The basic idea is that they're side by side. There's no order implied. So assume the positive and negative comments are comparable. They're balanced. It's equally favorable, equally unhappy, for President Obama. But what if the structure of the article looked like this? The positive comment was at the beginning of the article, and the negative comment was at the end. Is the article still balanced? Or should the positive comment count more because somebody who reads the article is going to read that really positive comment, and it's going to shape the way they read the rest of the article. And then also, a lot of people aren't even going to get to the end. So all they're going to see is this positive comment. That's going to shape what they read, and that's that. Or should the negative comment count more? Because somebody who reads the entire article and then they get to the very end and the last thing that they hear is something really negative, that's the thing they're going to be thinking about. That's the only thing they're going to remember. By the time they get to the bottom, they might not even remember what was in the opening paragraph. Which do you count more? It's hard to say. That's part of the problem with operationalizing bias. How do we determine what counts more? And the problem doesn't stop there. Thus far, what I've done is I focused on just the words that are involved in the news coverage, positive comments versus negative comments. If we really want to understand whether news coverage is biased, we also need to study the impact of visual images in the news. And as Professor Stevenson explained, that's what my research, my dissertation was on. Suppose we're trying to determine whether TV coverage of then Senator Obama at a campaign event is biased or balanced. And I want you to assume, for the purposes of this discussion, that when we looked at it, we used your definition of bias. There was equal number of positive and negative things about President Obama. So the verbal content of this report is, in fact, by our definition, balanced. But this is a TV report. And so let's assume while they're doing it and they're talking about the campaign event, the background, the video in the background, this is what it looks like. President Obama waving, engulfed by supporters, smiling, adoring crowds, all good stuff, all exactly what the campaign was trying to get on TV. The verbal portion is balanced. The visual content is extremely favorable to then Senator Obama. Is that a balanced report? Should the words and the pictures count the same? How do you measure that? How do you measure that difference? Are 8 seconds of someone saying something negative equal to 8 seconds of those kind of images? How do you measure that? Since people can rely on and more easily access pictures from memory, do you give that more weight or not? It's really hard to do. Now, my point here is that measuring bias, if you're going to approach it from like a political scientist, is complicated, which is why most of the research that's been done by political scientists on bias in the media has been inconclusive. Some of the studies find evidence of a liberal bias, some studies find evidence of a conservative bias, and for the most part, though, the studies have been inconclusive. Now, I know I've spent a lot of time going through this, but I think it's important to understand that individuals who are committed to studying politics and other subjects using scientific methods have to follow a strict set of guidelines. But most people aren't political scientists. Most people are normal. And I want to turn my attention to the normal people. I'm going to start by examining some of the common arguments that are made by those who argue that the media has a liberal bias, and then later those who argue that the media has a conservative bias. Although these groups come to different conclusions, the theoretical basis of their arguments are similar in one important respect. They are both grounded on assumptions about the people who are involved in producing the news. Now, proponents of the idea that the media has a liberal bias, they focus on the fact that Washington-based journalists are Democrats. Overwhelmingly Democrats. And there's ample evidence to back up that claim. I don't think there's any doubt about that. A number of surveys of Washington-based journalists indicate that they're far more likely to identify themselves as Democrats than Republicans. For example, the School of Journalism at Indiana University has done a number of studies over the years to ask Washington-based journalists about their party affiliation. This is a set of studies done from 1971 to 2013. In the most recent study, journalists were 4 times more likely to identify themselves as Democrats than Republicans. 28% identified themselves as Democrats, 7.1% as Republicans. Now, as the graph indicates, the percentage of journalists who identified themselves as Democrats is lower than it's been in past years, but it's hard to know what that means. It may reflect a growing sensitivity to the fact and to the charges that the media has a liberal bias. And so when they're interviewed now, instead of saying, yeah, I'm a Democrat, they identify themselves as independents. So what this may be measuring as far as journalists go is really a measure of really political correctness. But here's what I think I can tell you about political science. One of the things we know for sure. If somebody identifies themselves as a Democrat, or if they identify themselves as an independent who leans towards the Democratic Party, they vote exactly the same way. So despite the change, I doubt that there's been any big change in the party affiliation of journalists. And there's also been a decrease in the number of people who identify themselves as Republicans, only 7.1%. And this has been a shift that we've seen happening among the population. Some people have said that with a rightward shift of the Republican Party, more conservatives are identifying themselves as independents than Republicans. But once again, people who identify themselves as Republicans or independents leaning toward the Republican Party, they vote exactly in the same way. In other words, it's unlikely that much has changed other than the label that people put on themselves. However one explains the results, it's clear that Washington-based journalists self-identify as Democrats more than Republicans, and it's been that way for a long time. And for those who argue the media has a liberal bias, that's really all you need to know. But I want to examine the theoretical basis of their argument, not an attempt to refute it, but just an opportunity to explore it and explore its implications. I refer to this theoretical basis as the demographic blinders thesis. The substance of the argument is this: journalists are incapable of separating their personal beliefs from their professional obligations. Let me explain what I mean. First, all of us, everyone in this room, we can only see the world through the experiences that we've had, through the feelings that we've had, through our own unique set of circumstances. You've had a unique set of circumstances, I've had a unique set of circumstances, and none of us can really escape that. We can try to be empathetic of others, we can try and understand other people's points of views, but we really can't escape the fact that we have our own way of seeing the world. And journalists are no different. That's the basic idea. And so while it's true that they're taught in journalism school to be objective, they really can't step outside of their own blinders. They can't see the world any differently than they do. And whatever experiences that they've had has caused them to be more likely to identify as Democrats. So for example, when it comes to the issue of same-sex marriage, they're going to see that as an issue of equality, as an issue of fairness. When they go ahead and they hear people speak in opposition to same-sex marriage, they're going to connect them with people who oppose allowing blacks and whites to marry, people who oppose mixed marriages. And I'm not saying that's a fair comparison. My point here is that's how they're going to see it. And those feelings are going to go ahead and find their way into the news. How could it not? And it might be in subtle ways. They might stop talking about same-sex marriage, and now when they talk about the issue, they talk about marriage equality. Or to be balanced, they go ahead and they're going to interview somebody who supports same-sex marriage. They interview some very kindly person, and when they go ahead and find somebody to speak against same-sex marriage, they find some raving lunatic and they go, well, I'm being fair and balanced, when they're really not. And maybe they're doing it consciously, maybe they're not. For those who accept the demographic blinders thesis, so you don't have to impugn the character of journalists to assume that they're doing this. They might just be doing it because that's how they see the world. Now, for those who accept the demographic blinders thesis, there are other implications. If you're going to be consistent, if this argument makes sense to you, that you're going to have to accept. For example, research indicates that journalists are significantly more educated than the overall population. In 2013, 92% of journalists had a college degree. By comparison, in the overall population, 32% of the public had college degrees. So if you accept the demographic blinders thesis, people are sort of locked in seeing the world through their own set of experiences, and you're going to be consistent, you're going to have to assume that there's also an education bias in the media. That people who have college degrees are going to see the world through the eyes of somebody who's educated, and there's no real way for them to escape that. There's no way for them to report on the news from the perspective of somebody who's not educated. There's going to be a bias. And in this case, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we want the news to have an education bias. Maybe that's a good thing. But it also raises an interesting question. One of the things that we know is that as the level of education increases, so does tolerance for other groups. So there was a survey done in 2010 that asked this question. What about sexual relations between two adults of the same sex? Do you think it's always wrong, almost always wrong only sometimes, or wrong not at all? As you can see from the chart, there's a strong correlation between how people view this and their education. People with less than a college degree, 62% say it's always wrong. By the time you get to graduate degrees, only 25% say it's always wrong. The more educated people become, the more tolerant they become. And I'm not saying that anybody who would answer always wrong is necessarily uneducated. There are people who have very strong religious beliefs that motivate why they answer questions certain ways. But what we do know, and there's just no way around this, is that the more educated people become, the more likely they are going to be tolerant of other groups. Now, if the journalists are reporting news in a way that's supportive of same-sex marriage, we have to ask ourselves a question. Is that an example of a liberal bias, or is that an education bias? And how do we tell the difference? How do we know which is which? And there are other implications that follow for those who accept the demographic blinders thesis. As the graph indicates, there are very few minority journalists. Overall percentage of journalists in the US among Washington Post journalists, 8.5% of journalists in 2013 were minorities. In the population, the number is 37%. There is a white bias in the media. If you accept the demographic blinders thesis, there's a white bias. It has to be a white bias because whereas party identification, right, or educational attainment, those are things that you develop over life, right? What race you are, you're born with that. You can't ever escape that. You don't achieve that. That's something you're handed with. And so those blinders are going to be even stronger. Therefore, proponents of the demographic blinders thesis should also assume that there's a white bias in the news. And indeed, some have suggested that that's the reason. The white bias explains the difference between the coverage of what happened in Ferguson versus what happened in Keene. When young white people riot, that's not scary. That's not news. When young black people riot, that's scary, and therefore that's newsworthy. Research also indicates that journalists tend to be males. Right? Only, 62.5% of journalists, Washington-based journalists, were male. 37.5% are female. That's not representative of the population, as I'm sure you know. So like race, an individual is born male or female, and obviously there are some complicating factors there, but proponents of the demographic blinders thesis should go ahead and assume that there is a male bias in the news as well. So here's my point. Individuals who accept the argument, the demographic blinders thesis, if they're going to be consistent in their thinking, they're going to have to believe that there's a liberal bias, there's an education bias, there's a white bias, there's a male bias, and moreover, at any given time, there are a bunch of biases that are like happening at the same time. And then there are other biases that I haven't even mentioned. There may be a religious bias. There may be all kinds of things that we haven't thought about. Now, proponents of the idea that the media has a conservative bias focus on the fact that almost all major media outlets are owned by 6 large media corporations, and that's true. Time Warner, Walt Disney, Viacom, News Corp, CBS Corporation, and NBC Universal. I refer to the theoretical basis of their argument as the profit motive thesis. And the substance of the argument is this: corporations are almost exclusively interested in one thing: making a profit. Now, according to this argument, the way it works is corporations have a vested interest in going ahead and supporting conservative economic policies, such as reducing corporate taxes, reducing government regulation, opposing efforts to increase taxes on the wealthy, opposing efforts to go ahead and raise the minimum wage, reducing the power of labor unions. That this is what corporations would support. Proponents of the profit motive thesis essentially argue that it is completely implausible that these large media corporations would permit their media outlets to endorse liberal economic policies that would essentially make it harder for them to earn a profit. As with the demographic blinders thesis, there's an element of truth to the profit motive thesis. Corporate behavior is driven by the profit motive. But what's often forgotten is that the profit motive in some ways actually discourages corporations from producing news that cater to one ideological perspective. It's because of their reliance on profit and their desire for profits that they would not focus on just giving conservative or liberal news. Let me use as an example Comcast. Comcast owns MSNBC. Now, I will tell you that from my perspective, and people may disagree, MSNBC leans towards the liberal side, especially in prime time. Their hosts regularly talk in favor of liberal economic policies, and they regularly bash corporations and profits that corporations are making. Comcast also owns CNBC, a business channel, not very popular for most, but I'm a political junkie, so I watch it. It has a conservative bias. Their hosts tend to support conservative economic policies. And so this is the question. Why does Comcast have two stations that are ideologically opposed to one another? Completely different views, profit. Right? If they can make a profit selling news to liberals, they'll do it. If they can make a profit selling news to conservatives, they'll do it. The bank doesn't care. The bank doesn't say, do we deposit this in the liberal account or the conservative account? It's money. That's all they care about. Any business interested in making a profit is going to create a product that its consumers want to consume. And given that, here's the other thing. No one should be surprised if news coverage in the Los Angeles Times tends to reflect more favorably on Democrats, and news coverage in the Orange County Register tends to favor Republicans. These news outlets are catering to their public. They're giving them the product that they want. And we can explain that not by talking about bias among journalists. We can explain that difference between the coverage in the LA Times and the Orange County Register just by talking about the profit motive. Just by talking about the profit motive. As I said before, my goal in this part of the presentation is not to refute the demographic blinders thesis or the profit motive thesis. It's just to suggest that the issue of media bias is more complicated than the proponents of both perspectives suggest. The political affiliation, the education, race, and gender of journalists may in fact cause journalists to see the world in a certain way. But they clash. They're going on all the time. It's hard to know what's most important at any given time. And it's really hard to know how you would measure that. Corporations have a desire to go ahead and make a profit. And that may shape the kind of news that they produce, but on the other hand, they want to sell their product to as many people as they can. And so they're going to do that. Now, my goal in all of this, up to now, was to just go ahead and suggest to you that the topic of bias in the media is really complicated. If you're looking at it from the perspective of a political scientist, of a scholar, it's very hard to study. And that when you think about the people who make the claims about bias in the media and you start to drill down into why they believe what they believe and what their arguments are, it becomes significantly more complicated than I think they often let on. But for the remainder of the presentation, I want to focus on another source of bias in the news. You. And to explain what I mean, I want to describe why we designed the experiment we did. As I said, a colleague of mine at UCLA, Matthew Baum, who's now at Harvard, and I say that whenever I can, that I worked with somebody at Harvard, we were interested in assessing the extent to which individuals perceive bias in the news, even when it's not present. So we had this idea. It's actually kind of simple, but it was cool. The first thing we did was we created a transcript of a news report about the 2004 presidential election. Now, we were going to show subjects in our experiment the news report, an actual news report, but we just wanted to show them the words. So we weren't going to show them a TV report, we were going to show them a transcript. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by a transcript, if somebody were to go ahead and write down the words that I said tonight and then made them available for someone to read, that would be a transcript, as opposed to you being here or the videotaping that they're doing. So that's what I mean by a transcript. So the plan was to go ahead and have this experiment where we show them transcripts of a news report about the 2004 presidential election that's balanced. And by balanced, I mean that there are equal number of positive and negative comments about the presidential candidates, John Kerry for the Democrats, President Bush for the Republicans. Rather than trying to find a balanced transcript, we just wrote one ourselves. The subjects in our experiment didn't know that. They thought that they were reading an actual news transcript. But we wrote it very carefully to make sure that there were an equal number of positive comments about President Bush and about John Kerry. This was the first part of the transcript that subjects in the experiment saw. So this is what they would see. There were actually they saw 8 different versions of this, or like the rest of the report. So it said, good evening. We start tonight with the president. This is my journalist voice, by the way, my report. Good evening. We start tonight with the presidential candidates on the attack. Today, with just 13 days left in the campaign, John Kerry was explaining why he believes the president does not understand the problems of ordinary people, while for President Bush, the message was mostly about why Senator Kerry's plans will leave Americans worse off. Right? This was the idea. And in this case, what we did is we had John Kerry criticizing the president, and that's highlighting in blue. The president does not understand the problems of ordinary people. And when they read the report, by the way, we didn't highlight them in blue and in red. It was just all black font, right? And then you can see the second section there where it says Senator Kerry's plans will leave Americans worse off. That was like one positive thing about John Kerry saying something negative about the president saying something negative about John Kerry. That was the first thing they read. And then they read the remainder of the report. There were 8 different sections that they did this. And at the end, what we wanted to do is we wanted to see in this balanced report that we had written ourselves, so we knew it was balanced, whether they would see more favorable coverage of John Kerry or for more favorable coverage of President Bush. Now, there was one little twist in this experiment. What we did is we created 3 versions of the exact same transcript. The only difference between them was that one looked like it came from Fox News, one looked like it came from CNN, and one looked like it came from KNWZ9. Now, for those of you who are thinking, KNWZ9, we made that up too. That is a fake outlet. So if you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Here's why we set it up this way. We knew we'd written a balanced report. We knew it was equally positive and negative. And we wanted to see if people's opinions about Fox and CNN would affect whether or not they thought the coverage was biased. In other words, will people perceive bias even when it didn't exist? And that's why we created KNWZ9. Because we wanted them to go ahead, we wanted some people to read the transcript and have it come from a news outlet that they knew nothing about, that they didn't have any prior views about. When we created the transcripts, we made sure that the Fox and CNN logo were always on the screen. So when they did this one, if they got the Fox version of it, the Fox logo was up there. When they went to the second one, the Fox logo was up there. Same thing with CNN, same thing with KNWZ9. And then when it was the Fox News coverage, we actually had the name of the Fox anchor or the Fox journalist. When it was CNN, we had the name of the CNN anchor. And then for the KNWZ9 one, we just made up names. So this is how the experiment works. So now you have the basic layout of the experiment. This is how it worked. The first thing we did is we had our subjects fill out a survey. It was an extensive survey, and we asked them about a bunch of different media outlets. Now, the reason we asked them about a bunch of different media outlets is we wanted to know what they thought about Fox and CNN, but we didn't want to let them on as to what we were actually doing. And so that's what you have to do in an experiment. You kind of have to trick your subjects and not let them know exactly what it is you're doing. So we knew what they thought about Fox, and we knew what they thought about CNN. After they completed the survey, they went ahead and clicked continue, and then they were randomly assigned to one of three different conditions. They either saw the CNN version, or they saw the Fox version, or they saw the KNWZ version. They didn't see all three. They just got randomly assigned to one or the other. The computer just went ahead and picked out where they were going to go. And this is what we found. It turned out exactly as we expected. When people expected to see bias, they saw it. Now remember, at the beginning of the experiment, we asked them what they thought. If they thought CNN and Fox was liberal, balanced, or conservative. Since we knew the report was balanced, we figured that if they thought the coverage favored John Kerry, the Democrat, that meant that they were seeing a liberal bias in the news. If they thought the coverage favored President Bush, then that meant that they saw a conservative bias in the news. Well, here's what actually happened. If somebody wound up getting randomly assigned to the CNN condition, they saw the CNN version of the report, and they said in the survey at the very beginning that they thought CNN had a liberal bias, they wound up going ahead and in their evaluation of the report, they thought it favored Senator Kerry, the Democrat. They thought that they told us ahead of time there was a liberal bias on CNN, and when they did their evaluations, guess what? They thought Kerry got better coverage than President Bush. If somebody got the CNN condition, they were randomly assigned to it, but they had told us that they thought CNN had a conservative bias, and at that time there were people who were making that claim because it was right before the war in Iraq, and people felt that CNN was going ahead and sort of cheerleading on the war. So there were people who made that argument. If they thought CNN had a conservative bias, when they did their analysis, it turned out that they thought the coverage favored President Bush. The same pattern happened with Fox. Anybody who was randomly assigned, when people were randomly assigned to the Fox condition, if there weren't very many people who said that Fox had a liberal bias, it was a very small sample, but even among those people, and it was a really small sample, it was still the case that they said the coverage favored John Kerry. Most people who wound up with the Fox condition thought, and who had told us that Fox had a conservative bias, right, they thought the coverage favored President Bush. Everybody was seeing exactly what they expected to see. If they were expecting to see a liberal bias, they saw it. If they were expecting to see a conservative bias, they saw it. What about the people who saw KNWZ? The people who saw KNWZ, they thought the coverage was balanced. They had no prior opinions to bring into the picture, and so they saw what was in the news. What I'm suggesting here, and what we found, is not to suggest that there's no bias in the media, that all media outlets are balanced. That's not the case. What we're suggesting here, and what we showed in our experiment, is that it may be that some of the bias that you see in the news is actually your own bias being reflected back at you. Back a few years ago, I had a student at actually Moore Park College. It's a very conservative student. And she used to go ahead and tell me that the Los Angeles Times, she thought it should be called the Democratic Times, that it was an arm of the Democratic Party. And I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you a newspaper article, and I'm going to take out any identifying features that let you know where it came from. And I want you to go ahead, and I want you to tell me if it came from the Los Angeles Times or whether it came from the Washington Times. And I let her know that the Washington Times is known for having a conservative bias. And I sent it to her. I think I sent it to her like in Notepad or something, so like it was just words. And I asked her, tell me what you think. And when she came back to me, she said, I think this was from the Los Angeles Times. And she was right, it was. But here's what she said. And this is a student who wound up going from Moore Park to being a Regents Scholar at UCLA, and she recently graduated from Harvard Law School. This is a really bright student. She said, I know, As I was reading through this, I know that if I had read this in the Los Angeles Times, I would have seen it as completely biased. And that's sort of the challenge for you guys today, and what I want you guys to take away from this. The next time you're watching the news, the next time you're seeing something that's biased, that strikes you as biased, ask yourself, how would I feel about it if I saw it on another channel? How would I feel if I saw it on a station that I do trust or don't trust? And then you might get an idea of how much of the bias that you're seeing in the news is actually in the news, and then how much is coming from you. Thank you guys very much.
Professor.
Thank you.
Professor Phil Gussin, give him a big round of applause. Phil's now a member of our Hall of Fame here at COC, so welcome. I'd like to bring up on stage three people who have awards to present Phil for all of his hard work. Joe McGregor from the Board of Trustees, Dr. Jerry Buckley from the administration, and Mr. Murray Wood from the COC Foundation. Thank you, everybody.
Great job.
Thank you for your,
Really great job.
I hope you saw your input in this.
Well, you did a great job.
I want to thank Phil so much. I have enjoyed the opportunity of working with him the last few meetings of the Scholarly Presentation Committee and watching his presentation grow and grow. I think we're very fortunate at COC to have this type of professor teaching you. Many of you here have enjoyed that. I know you've benefited from that teaching, and I know that we've had this is our 24th scholarly presentation, and all of the presentations have been excellent, superb. I have learned something from every one. I want to read a plaque that we're giving to Phil from the Board of Trustees at the college. It's the annual scholarly presentation. This actually comes from the foundation. Dr. Phil Gussin, in the eye of the beholder, perception of bias in the media, in recognition of your support, November 20th, 2014. We thank you so very much. Along with the presentations to Phil, I do want to ask that his family stand if they're willing to do that. We couldn't find them before. We're so happy you're here today, this evening. Thank you.
There's my mom up there.
Ah, Mom's up there. Yay, Mom. And I also just want to add a word of thanks again to Judge Kleeman, Frank Kleeman, a good friend and someone who has been on this committee and has been through almost all, I think, of these 24 presentations as far as helping to select those visionaries that have presented to us over the years, and his lovely wife, Charlotte, who's been there right beside him. They've been wonderful members of our foundation board, members of our foundation, and have given so much to scholarships and to this scholarly presentation, so I personally want to thank him again. Thank you.
So my job this evening is to present Phil with flowers. I guess it is a new age. I've had the honor now of basically presenting honors to the scholarly presenter the past 3 times. And last year when I was here, I described how this type of presentation is part of what we call the Academy. And if you don't know what that is, if you're a student, I recommend that you look that up and look at the history of the Academy, because you're here as part of being a student in a college, probably in some cases soon to be a student at a university. The Academy has a very rich history going back to Greek times, so I recommend that you look that up, but I won't spend time on it tonight. Rather, tonight I'd like to talk about the word scholar. A scholar has basically several definitions, potentially. A learned or erudite person, especially one who has profound knowledge of a particular subject. Could be a student or a pupil, or a student who has been awarded a scholarship. Also, another definition says could be a learned person, especially in the humanities. A person, especially a child who studies. A student of merit at an educational establishment who receives financial aid from an endowed given for such a purpose. So the point is tonight, it's interesting that we have in this very room representatives of all of these definitions. We have students. We have a learned individual who's spent time sharing with us this evening. What more could we ask for? Scholarly work infers that the subject matter has undergone peer review, a process where others in the discipline, considered experts, will look at the work and provide input. We heard that is what the process is here. In other cases, it could be other academic scholars that critically review the work and deem it to be significant and worthy of discussion in a public forum, either in print or delivered to an audience, as tonight. Dr. Gussin's work has undergone such a review by his peers, and this evening we recognize Phil's significant contribution to the collective body of academic research in his discipline, as well as a great discussion this evening. We should also recognize Dr. Gussin's contribution to teaching and learning here at the College of the Canyons through noting that he serves as the faculty advisor to the Model UN organization, which has provided our students with the opportunity to experience discussion and problem solving related to significant worldwide issues and to compete against other similar student organizations at community colleges and also at the university level. His students consistently excel in these competitions and bring back awards directly attributable to Dr. Gussin's mentorship. My sincerest congratulations to Dr. Gussin on his incredible presentation this evening and his commitment to student learning and success. Thank you.
My name's Murray Wood, and I'm here on behalf of the College of the Canyons Foundation and filling in the footsteps of our board member, Judge Frank Kleeman. A word about the foundation. The foundation is the philanthropic arm of the college, and our job is really to generate resources to provide for student success, a variety of different programs. And one of the programs that we're most proud of is each year the presentation of the scholarly presentation. I'm honored to present a modest honorarium to Dr. Gussin this evening, not only for his excellent scholarship, but because he is emblematic of his fellow faculty members, his fellow colleagues, who are here because they want to be mentors and they want to be teachers, and as well as be able to share their scholarship with their students. So with that, thank you very, very much. We look forward to more and more honors for you.
Thank you.
In conclusion, again, I just, on behalf of the Board of Trustees and our Chancellor, who unfortunately could not be here this evening, I want to thank you all for coming, for staying. I know that we have a lot to talk about, as we heard some provocative and interesting information this evening. I want to invite personally any foundation members that are here, community members, and the family to please join us at the reception, and of course, all faculty and staff. Thank you. Thanks again. Thank you so much. Really nice. And of course, please let your family know to come join us.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you so
Good,
much.
good.